Hello, this is Dr. Annette Moultrie, and welcome to Managerial Accounting. We will be covering several chapters in managerial accounting, so please watch out for our videos.
But before we proceed with the video, I need you to click on the subscribe button. Click on the thumbs up button below. Also, click on the notification bell so you'll be notified of upcoming videos.
In this video, we will cover the chapter on job order costing. This is part 1 of job order costing. The learning objectives are: 1, distinguish between job order costing and process costing. 2, record materials and labor costs in a job order costing system. 3, record actual and allocated overhead costs in a job order costing system. 4, record the completion and sales of finished goods. 5, adjust for over-allocated and under-allocated overhead. 6, calculate cost of goods manufactured and cost of goods sold. And finally, 7, calculate job costs for a service company. We will begin with learning objective 1. Distinguish between job order costing and process costing. So how do manufacturing companies use job order and process costing systems? A manager's primary duties include planning and controlling. Cost accounting systems accumulate product cost information so that managers can measure how much it costs to produce each unit of product. Knowing product unit costs helps managers set the selling prices that will generate profits, compute cost of goods sold for the income statement, and also compute the cost of inventory for the balance sheet. There are 2 types of traditional cost accounting systems. One is, of course, the job order costing, and the other is process costing. Now, job order costing is used for businesses that produce unique products or provide specialized services. Costs are accumulated for each batch or for each job. Examples of the type of companies that use job order costing are the accounting firms, music studios, healthcare providers, building contractors, and custom furniture manufacturers. Process costing. It is used by businesses that manufacture large quantities of identical units. A process costing system accumulates the cost of each process needed to complete the product. Here in Exhibit 2-1, it's an illustration of the major differences between job order costing and process costing. Now, some companies may use both job order and process costing. For example, an RV manufacturing company, they might use process costing for its standard units, but would use job order costing for custom-made orders. Both job order and process costing systems are using a 4-step method to track product costs. One is accumulate, assign, allocate, and adjust. Now look for the 4 steps as we track the product cost through the inventory accounts on the balance sheet to cost of goods sold on the income statement. Here with the job order costing system, the product type, batches of unique products or specialized services, whereas the process costing system, the product type are similar or identical to products manufactured through a series of uniform steps or processes. Job order costing system, customized, the production activities are customized, whereas the process costing system, they're repetitive. The product cost accumulation, the job order costing system is by job, whereas the process costing system is by process. Learning objective 2.2, record materials and labor costs in a job order costing system. The how do materials and labor costs flow through the job order costing system. A job order costing system tracks costs as raw materials move from the storeroom to the production floor, where they are converted into finished products. Smart Touch Learning uses the job cost record to document the product cost for each job. You have the direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. As you see here in this exhibit, it provides an example of a completed job order for job number 27. As with all financial statements in this chapter, the following table contains amount in dollars unless otherwise. Here you see with this job cost record, job 27, the customer is Central College Bookstore, and the job description, 15 tablets with accounting e-learning software. In a job order costing system, companies must accumulate costs and then assign costs to each job. Costs are accumulated when the company purchases raw materials, incurs direct labor, and incurs manufacturing overhead. The company starts the job cost record when work begins on the job. As Smart Touch Learning incurs costs, the company adds costs to the job cost record, and the costs are added to the work in process inventory, or WIP. When Smart Touch Learning finishes the job, the company totals the costs and then transfers the cost from work in process inventory to finished goods inventory. The costs transferred to finished goods inventory are called cost of goods manufactured, or COGM. When the job units are sold, the costing system moves the cost from finished goods inventory, which is an asset, to cost of goods sold, which is an expense. Here in this exhibit 2-3, it diagrams the flow of costs for 3 jobs, job number 27, 28, and 29. Job 27, 28, and 29. Now, it shows the flow of costs for those 3 jobs that were worked on during the accounting period at Smart Touch Learning. Smart Touch Learning worked on many jobs in addition to those 3 jobs that we mentioned during the year. In this exhibit, notice that job 27 and 28 were completed. They were completed and they were transferred from WIP to finished good. Job 27 was delivered to the customer. So those costs were transferred from finished good to cost of goods sold. Job 29 is the only job that is not complete and it's still in process. Job 28 is complete, but not delivered to the customer. So we see here, job 27 is the only job completed and there are 2 aspects to accounting for raw materials. One is purchasing materials, and the other is using materials in production. Raw materials do not have to be used immediately when purchased and can be stored for later use. Materials purchased and materials used in production are usually two different amounts. During 2026, Smart Touch Learning purchases raw material for $367,000 on account. Now, this is a product cost that accumulates in the raw materials inventory account. Smart Touch Learning records the journal entry for the entire year rather than showing each individual purchase to simplify the recording process. The raw material subsidiary ledger includes a separate record for each type of material that Smart Touch Learning uses to produce its tablets. So Smart Touch Learning would have separate pages in the ledger for the batteries, for the processors, for cases, and other materials that they use. Here you see in Exhibit 2-4, it shows us an example of Smart Touch Learning's raw material subsidiary ledger for batteries. A subsidiary ledger allows for better control of inventory because it helps track each type of material in production. Remember that the balance of the raw materials inventory account in the general ledger should always equal the sum of the balances in the raw materials subsidiary ledger. Here you see with this raw material subsidiary ledger, you have item number B103, and description is STL batteries. When Smart Touch starts Job 27, they started on January 14, 2026. The production team requests materials for the job by filling out a materials requisition, as you see here in Exhibit 2-5. A materials requisition is a request. It is a request for the transfer of raw materials to the production floor. Notice here the subsidiary ledger that we previously saw in Exhibit 2-4. It records the materials requisition number, which was 342, along with the number of units requisitioned and their costs. Here in this example, or this exhibit, you have the materials requisition number 342. The date is January 14, 2026, job number 27, and it was requested by Hugh Patterson. This is an example of the materials requisition. When the raw materials are received on the production floor, they are recorded on the job cost record. Here in Exhibit 2-6, it shows the job cost record for number 27, job number 27, after the materials requisition number 342 has been recorded. The raw materials added to job 27 from this materials requisition are considered direct materials because the batteries can be easily and cost-effectively traced directly to the finished tablet. Here in this job cost record is job number 27, Customer Central College Bookstore, and the description, 15 tablets with accounting e-learning software. Smart Touch Learning records a summary journal entry at the end of the period for all materials used. To produce the tablets, you have both direct and indirect materials that are being used. Remember that direct materials, they can be easily and cost effectively traced directly to the finished product. However, indirect materials cannot be easily and cost effectively traced directly to the finished product. In 2026, Smart Touch Learning uses direct materials costing $355,000 and indirect materials costing $17,000. Work in process inventory, it has a beginning balance of $8,000. So to record the use of direct materials, the cost of direct materials is transferred out of raw materials inventory and it is assigned to work in process inventory. The amount debited to work in process inventory is the total of the individual cost records. To record the use of indirect materials, the cost of the indirect materials is also transferred out of the raw materials inventory account. However, these costs are accumulated in the manufacturing overhead account with a debit. Manufacturing overhead is a temporary account. It's a temporary account that is used to accumulate indirect production costs during the accounting period. Now, because it is a temporary account, it is classified as an equity account. Now, we will show how manufacturing overhead is adjusted later in this presentation. Exhibit 2-7 that you see here, it shows the job cost record for number 27, job number 27. Direct labor costs are assigned to the job based on labor time records. Now, most companies, they use an electronic system. They use an electronic system to streamline the tracking of labor costs. Employees use ID cards to swipe in and swipe out, and then the job information is entered. The time is automatically added to the appropriate job cost record. If a manual system is used, each employee completes a labor time record or a timesheet that indicates the amount of time spent on each job. Here you see for job number 27, you have time dated 1/15, labor time record number 236, and the dollar amount is $90 for during 2026, Smart Touch Learning incurs total labor costs of $197,000, of which $169,000 is direct labor and $28,000 is indirect labor. Recall that direct labor costs can be easily and cost effectively traced directly to the finished product. Indirect labor costs cannot. Indirect labor costs consist of labor costs for employees working in the factory, but not directly on the products, including employees in supervision, maintenance, and janitorial position. The total cost of direct labor is debited to work in process inventory. The indirect labor costs are accumulated in manufacturing overhead by debiting that account. Now, this is the same treatment as for the direct and indirect materials illustrated back in transaction number 2. Learning objective 2.3, record actual and allocated overhead costs in a job order costing system. How do overhead costs flow through the job order costing system? Smart Touch Learning has already accumulated the cost of indirect materials that was in transaction 2, and they've accumulated the cost of indirect labor that you saw in transaction 3 to manufacturing overhead. In addition to indirect materials and indirect labor, Smart Touch Learning also incurs depreciation expense, utilities expense on the plant, insurance expense on the plan, and plant property taxes. So you see here in transaction 4-7, you have depreciation on manufacturing plant and equipment of $20,000, plant utilities $7,000, insurance is $6,000, and plant property taxes incurred but not yet paid of $5,000. All manufacturing overhead costs are accumulated as debits to the manufacturing overhead account. Here in this example, you see all the transactions 4, 5, 6, and 7, where you see the manufacturing overhead has a debit. Manufacturing overhead has a debit. Transaction 4, a debit of $20,000. Transaction 5, a debit of $7,000 for manufacturing overhead, $6,000 debit for transaction number 6, and number 10, the $5,000, which was the property taxes. By the end of the year, the manufacturing overhead account has accumulated all the actual overhead costs as debits. Here you see here that the manufacturing overhead T account has debit for transaction 2, the $17,000, transaction 3, $28,000, transaction 4, $20,000, transaction 5, $7,000, transaction 6, $6,000, and transaction 7, $5,000, with a total debit balance of $83,000. Here you see this note. In a merchandising company, these costs would have been recorded as selling and administrative expenses. That's in a merchandising company, such as depreciation expense, utility expense, insurance expense, and property taxes expense. However, for a manufacturing company, these costs are not selling and administrative expenses, but instead they are indirect product costs, and they are accumulated in the manufacturing overhead account. The most accurate allocation of manufacturing overhead can be made only when total overhead costs are known, which is not until the end of the period. But managers, they can't wait that long for product cost information. So what they have to do is that the predetermined overhead allocation rate is calculated before the period begins. So they calculate it before the period begins. Now, companies use the predetermined overhead allocation rate to allocate estimated overhead costs to individual jobs. The predetermined overhead allocation rate is the estimated overhead cost per unit of the allocation base, calculated at the beginning of the accounting period. So the predetermined overhead allocation rate is equal to total estimated overhead costs divided by total estimated quantity of the overhead allocation base. The key to allocating indirect manufacturing costs to a job is to identify a workable manufacturing overhead allocation base. And the allocation base is a denominator that links indirect costs to cost objects. So ideally, the allocation base is the primary cost driver of the indirect costs. And a cost driver is the primary factor that causes a cost to either increase or decrease. There are three cost drivers that are commonly used by manufacturers. One is direct labor costs, and machine hours. Okay. Direct labor hours or direct labor costs are appropriate cost drivers for companies whose production is labor intensive. Machine hours are used when production is machine intensive. At the end of 2025, Smart Touch Learning estimated that total overhead costs for 2026 would be $68,000 and direct labor costs would total $170,000. Now, using this information, the predetermined overhead allocation rate is calculated as you see here. Excuse me. The predetermined overhead allocation rate is equal to total estimated overhead cost divided by total estimated quantity of the overhead allocation base. So in this example, the predetermined overhead allocation rate is equal to $68,000 divided by $170,000, which will equal 40% of direct labor costs. As jobs are completed in 2026, Smart Touch Learning will allocate overhead costs using the predetermined overhead allocation rate and assign 40% of each direct labor dollar incurred for the job as manufacturing overhead costs. Smart Touch Learning uses the same predetermined overhead rate to allocate manufacturing overhead to all jobs worked on throughout the year, including jobs still in process at the end of the accounting period. So we're going to use job number 27 in this example. The total direct labor cost for job 27 is $1,250. And the predetermined overhead allocation rate is 40% of direct labor costs. Job 27 produced 15 tablets. Here in Exhibit 2-8, it shows the allocated manufacturing overhead cost of $500 on the job cost record. The cost summary section of the completed job cost record for this company, or yes, Central College Bookstore, audit shows that job number 27 costs Smart Touch Learning a total of $4,500. And that $4,500 is comprised of $750 for direct materials, $1,250 for direct labor, and $500 of allocated manufacturing overhead. Smart Touch Learning's total direct labor cost for 2026 is $169,000. So the total overhead allocated to all jobs is the 40% of the $169,000 direct labor cost, which equates to $67,600. Here you see the journal entry to record the allocation of overhead. There's a debit to work in process inventory of $67,600, and there is a credit to manufacturing overhead of $67,600. This is the end of part 1 of the chapter on job order costing. Please watch out for the next video, part 2 of job order costing.
Thank you for watching. And please, if you haven't already, please click the subscribe button below.